Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy's series Historical Analogies. We are today at our 23rd entry. We are slowly nearing the end of this course that has 26 entries. And today we're going to be talking about a very interesting historical analogy, a very curious one, an analogy that in many ways is different than the ones we've previously addressed. And it's different not only chronologically, but also thematically. Now, we're going to be talking about Cubism on one end. You could argue more specifically Analytical Cubism, though I would say Cubism more in general would be more appropriate, and the Harlem Renaissance and its many different branches and developments that came out of it. This is a very curious topic because we are nearing a moment where these two stylistical formations really are almost happening at the same time. Now, usually what we've done thus far was that we were taking stylistical formations that were separated either by decades or by centuries. You've noticed that in the beginning of the course, we were discussing different centuries. We were discussing stylistical formations that either had to do with the pre-modern and modern period. And then in the second half of the course, we started addressing analogies between stylistical formations that mostly happened in the modern period. Now we got to this sort of synchronic view of things that we're addressing, Analytical Cubism and Harlem Renaissance, that for the most part run alongside each other. But there is a very strong and very important historical analogy to be made, specifically if we are talking about Cubism happening in the beginning of the 20th century, and then influences and derivatives, if you will, of Harlem Renaissance happening at the end of the 20th century and arguably are happening to this day. Now, what I'm talking about, and more specifically here, is hip-hop. Now, hip-hop, as we know, is an extremely layered and dense and important topic. It's a culture rather than music that is often associated to it, that we call rap music. And it's a very deep phenomenon that is extremely influential, that has taken over the world by storm. Now, although we can say that both hip-hop and rap are something that comes from the United States of America and mostly has to do with the African-American community there, it has proven to be incredibly influential and incredibly easy to export. And it exists then in, I would say, pretty much every country in the world, or almost everyone. So we can talk about Greek rap music and Serbian and French and German and Russian, and you can pretty much name any culture, any nation you want. It's very likely that they have their own hip-hop scene, and it's very likely that they have their rap music, and that hip-hop scene is then creating a lot of art that is dedicated to that culture and that comes out of the context of that culture. Graffiti art, for example. Now, we want to go back to connection between Harlem Renaissance and everything it spawned and Cubism, because this is a very interesting connection. And again, it's going to be quite curious what we're going to be doing. Most of our time is going to be spent on the first half of the 20th century and Harlem Renaissance proper, and then some, I would say, smaller quantity of time will be spent to discuss its, different branches and what it engendered. So I want to address the term Renaissance to begin with, because we are talking about the Harlem Renaissance, something that was called the New Negro Movement to begin with, but then this other term was adopted instead. Renaissance, as we know, has to do with a very peculiar context. It has to do with Italy. It lasted for centuries, but more important than that, it has its cultural and political and ideological aspects that are very important to address. When we're talking about the Renaissance, we are not just talking about a different style that was being used to depict, let's say, human anatomy. We're not just talking about a style that had to do with depth of field and the line of the horizon and applying different mathematical and spatial rules to visual arts. It really has to do with this whole idea of new humanity. We often say humanism and Renaissance, but we tend to use them interchangeably. We have this idea of the Renaissance as basically the movement that spawned new humanity, that created new humanity, and that truly made new humanity possible. It was not only a harbinger, but also a vehicle of new humanity. So you could say that the Renaissance is a more layered term than perhaps we initially give it credit. It's not just about how you paint things, it's about how you see other people, it's about how you see your society. It has its cultural and political and economical aspects. We can say that this is the period that is very much defined by mercantile capitalism when we're talking about Renaissance. This is very much the period where art initiative does not solely come from the church, but starts coming from private, from owners of private capital, from very wealthy people, from bourgeois people. So we can say that this is the moment in history where mercantile capitalism becomes an incredibly important not only ideology, but also mode of production, also facet of economy, and where it becomes important enough to basically rival feudalistic regime and its culture and its mores and its visual representation, namely architecture, painting, sculpture, etc. So when we say Renaissance, we have this revolutionary idea that we are changing the entire world. And you remember that previously we've discussed some of the revolutions. We talked at length about the Industrial Revolution, but we also mentioned the French and Bolshevik revolutions as very important. We've mentioned the American Revolution a couple of times. So there is this whole idea that goes with the revolution, and that's very similar to the usage of the term Renaissance, that you want to change everything. You're not just creating art in terms of different visual representation. You're not just acting in the realm and the domain of the visual, of the plastic. Truly, you're acting in the domain of the political. And this is something that is of imperative importance when it comes to Harlem Renaissance. You can understand that these people sought to create art that was highly political and highly ideological, and it is supposed to be the vessel of their fight for recognition, for actualization, fight for a better life. And that's a whole other topic. So when we're looking at this, we have to start, I would argue, by the very term Renaissance. Why is it being used? Because we're talking about new humanity, especially for the African American community, especially if we're thinking about the context of the Harlem Renaissance, meaning in this particular case that we're talking about the people who are mostly fleeing the South, escaping Jim Crow, and are installing themselves in the North. Some of them go to Chicago, some of them go to New York. We are talking mostly about these because, as we know, Harlem is an area of the city of New York. We are going to be talking about the connection with African art a lot, and this is how it becomes interesting for us to make this historical analogy, and this is how we talk about how Harlem Renaissance has a lot to do with Cubism. Now, you could argue that in previous installments, when we were talking about connections between, let's say, Romanesque art and neoclassicism, most of these people were not necessarily aware of existence of one such analogy. I can perfectly well imagine a neoclassical painter not caring particularly about Romanesque art, not being aware that they're creating inside a stylistical formation that bears many important similitudes and analogies with this other historic period. This is not the case when it comes to Harlem Renaissance. These people are very much aware of Cubism. They're very much aware of people like Picasso or Braque and other people, I would argue, that do not necessarily get connected to Cubism directly. People like Modigliani and Matisse, we think of them not as Cubists, but as of something else, but they create a part of this context too. You could say that the Harlem Renaissance generally nurtures a very strong connection with the European continent and with the European arts and everything that has to do with modern art. This becomes a very, very important part of the Harlem Renaissance. So we've addressed the different chronology that we're going to be using, and we've addressed the fact that, the Harlem Renaissance officially more or less ended with the period of Great Depression, and of course it lingered on for a while. It's something that we connect to the beginning of the 20th century. We do not necessarily talk about it after the Depression is ended, or we're not talking about it certainly in terms of the second half of the 20th century, but as we said, it influenced a great many things. because part of the Harlem Renaissance, very important aspect of it really was music and was cinema and was theater and was literature. It wasn't just paintings and sculptures. We are talking about those. But the most important part that I'm arguing here is that heritage of the Harlem Renaissance continued to live on through jazz music and blues music. And as we know, those survived the Great Depression. We are talking about the literary influences that also have survived the Great Depression and were present well into the second half of the 20th century. And then, of course, when we were talking about influence of Harlem Renaissance on hip-hop culture and generally rap music, we are talking obviously about something that goes well into the second half of the 20th century, the very end of the 20th century, and of course, well, our current moment where we are today. Yeah, now the thing we need to address here is the very peculiar set of circumstances that create the connection between Cubism on one end, Harlem Renaissance on the other, and then African art on the third. We said that this mostly has to do with African American community in the United States of America, and we see this great impulse, this great necessity for them to actualize and rediscover their connection to Africa. This appellation that we use to call them African American, of course, has African to begin with. So they see themselves as belonging to this vast continent. Now, for whichever reason, most of them are colonial and most of them are also very racist, we tend to think about Africa as a singular space. Nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, this is an immense continent that has many different climates, many different peoples, many different cultures, languages. It's truly incredibly diverse. So you can't really talk of Africa no more than you can talk about Europe. I would argue that there's more variety inside Africa than there is inside Europe, if anything else, in terms of climate and geography. But then many other things as well. So if we say that something is African, air quotes, that's not really saying a lot. And mostly what it is saying, it's saying about the colonial world as it is, that we tend to divide first world and the third world. We tend to see Africa mostly from this colonial point of view. Now, as you know, colonialism is something that has a lot to do with slavery for most of its existence, and it's something that has a lot to do, then again, with creation, existence, and functioning of the United States of America, which was a slave-owning country for a while. And it was a colony itself that got liberated. You're familiar with the history. So when we're talking about all of these problems, when we're talking about people being transported from Africa to the Caribbean or then to United States of America, or what will eventually become United States of America, we are talking about these issues. And of course, these are the issues that are very, very present in the context of the Harlem Renaissance, as much as they are present in Europe when we're talking about Cubism. Now, of course, there are differences, and we're going to address them, but there are also many important similarities. When we're talking about artists that created in the context of the Harlem Renaissance, they're the people who had to move from the south to north. They had to come from southern states where Jim Crow was still active to the northern states. So they've changed their environment considerably. They've made a long, arduous journey to live in a completely different context, which means that they've moved from the rural context of the south to the highly urban and highly urbanized context of the north. If you're talking about the New York at the beginning of the 20th century, but I mean even New York nowadays, we are truly talking about the incredibly industrialized city. We are talking about, for a certain period of time, the most industrialized city in the world. The city that had most skyscrapers, the city that was booming and bursting with industrial prowess. And that, of course, is an incredibly different context than rural South. You could say that in the South, still in many places in the American South, you don't necessarily have the subway. This is a really big deal, especially if you have to use the subway every day. You have to go underground, you have to take the train that is underground. And this is always, to a certain extent, unpleasant, even today, even if you're very accustomed to using the subway. But you can imagine that it was even more unpleasant back in the day when you came from the south and you saw something like the subway, something like the skyscraper, not to mention cars or planes or all of those things. for the first time in your life, or you would get to see electricity for the first time in your life. Now, this is kind of comparable to what we were talking about when we were discussing France, and when we were discussing this slow march of industrialization. That we can say that Paris was a very industrialized place, and it was at the turn of the century, but then the rest of France was still pretty much living in the medieval period in terms of technology that they had available. And it's the same thing in New York. So people that were coming from the French Campagne, from the French countryside, to Paris were absolutely smitten by what they saw. They were mind blown. This was an incredible difference to see electric light and public transportation and the subway and all these other things. So you could say that these people who came from the south to north were blown away by many things, and they had the reason to make this connection to reconnect themselves with their ancestors that were taken from Africa and brought to United States of America. So they too had to make an arduous journey. They too had to change their climate, perhaps even more completely. They had to find themselves in new and oftentimes very unfavorable circumstances. Most unfavorable, actually. So you could say that there was this kind of historical analogy inside the Harlem Renaissance. And there was this whole thing that most of these people still had relatives that actively remembered the slavery. They were one generation removed from that entire thing. So that's something that obviously colors your family life, let's put it that way. And that's something that bears immense weight, especially, again, if you're changing your environment that completely. And all of these things were present in this particular art, which makes us think about Cubism and its connection to Cubism even more. Now, what's the deal with Cubism on the other end? We mentioned that it has to do with cinema, it has to do with moving images, fractals, and how to represent image from fragments rather than the whole. We're not going to go through all of that again because we already went through it. What I want to suggest is that Cubism really has to do with industry and how it's a reaction to the industrial society. And you can say the same thing about the Harlem Renaissance. Everything about this movement is a reaction to the industrial society and is strongly anchored in nature. Of course, black nature, you could argue. And has a lot to do with Africa as the cradle of African American people, well, of African people who before became African American were just African. Now, more specifically, and this is something that is really interesting, this is something that we're going to be addressing most, I think, it has to do with a certain kind of atavism that was actively exploited and actualized by Cubist artists. It has to do with a very peculiar way in which they look at African art. And this is something that I find so interesting and, well, very troubling, really, politically speaking. It has to do with the fact that if we're talking about Cubism, it's part of this general malaise that Europe suffered from, especially Western Europe, this whole idea that we have no creativity left in us anymore. We have no new ideas left. We don't have basically anywhere more to go. We've completely used up all of the creative juices that we've had, and we are just doomed to eternal repetition. This was brought on by centuries of styles that didn't really change that much. You could say that, what started with the Renaissance, to go back to the original European Renaissance, and then continued with Baroque, and then continued with Classicism and Neoclassicism, didn't really change that much. How different are Renaissance paintings from neoclassical paintings? I mean, of course, yes, they're different, and we can spend days talking about differences, but they're also kind of similar. Uncomfortably similar, if you will. And that's the whole point. People had enough of what they saw as one and the same for almost 500 years. They sought something new, and they saw art as this eternal repetition of one and the same. So they had this brilliant idea that was deeply colonial, again, that in order to create new art, you have to travel, you have to go to exotic places, you have to expose yourself to the so-called primitive art. Now, this is where we're getting to the gist of the problem. They felt that European salvation was tightly connected to this atavistic idea of primitivism. When we're talking about these people, again, Picasso, Modigliani, Matisse, and many others, especially expressionists, we are talking about people who are primitivists. They're, of course, cubists, and there are many other stylistical formation and their appellations, but most of all, they're primitivists. They have this idea that art should be primitive, that it should go back to something that is original and existentially important and fundamentally human. Now, this is the interesting part. You could say that Cubists were trying, and Fauvists and Expressionists and many other people, they were trying to discover what is originally human, and they sought humanity. And they sought humanity mostly because they felt afraid that machines were destroying it. They were afraid of the industrial process. Now, you could argue that Harlem Renaissance artists also sought humanity, but not necessarily that they were endangered in their humanity by machines. Not that they were seeking emancipation or salvation from the machines. No, they were seeking emancipation and betterment from other humans, from very unjust society in which they lived in. So they too wanted to affirm their humanity. They too wanted to actualize it, seek what was seen as lost or stolen, and then bring it up to the surface. So you could say that they ended up having very similar goal, although this goal came from very different motivations and very different historical circumstances. And funnily enough, they both saw the answer in Africa. They both thought that the answer to their woes was in Africa. That actualizing, and not to say steal from, African art was the answer, was the key. And then we can say that they've adopted African art to be a very important part of their expression, both Cubists and Harlem Renaissance artists. And you can see this very clearly if you're looking at a lot of their paintings, if you're looking at a lot of their sculptures, they're obviously inspired by African art. And I say this is a very problematic thing, problematic historically and ideologically speaking, because you could argue that what Harlem Renaissance artists were doing came from vital necessity. They sought to affirm entire people and their culture and their race, and they sought betterment for an entire race within a certain context of a certain nation. And this is a very legitimate cause. I mean, what could be more legitimate than that? You want to fight for your people, you want them to have a better life, you want them to be recognized as humans. I mean, it's as simple as that. Whereas on the other end, in Europe, you have people who are basically bored and who seek other ways of expressing themselves. And while some Cubists were very left-leaning, and while they were very, some of them even radicalized to the left, and they fought for the better world, I would argue that if we talk about Cubism and we're talking about this entire primitivist movement, we are truly talking about people who were authorial artists. I mean, politics were not quite as important as they were with the Harlem Renaissance artists. But Africa announced itself as the answer to all of their issues. African art. Now, this is the problem we're getting to. In most cases, when we're talking about Picasso or Braque to a lesser extent, we are not talking about African art that they've appropriated, because they didn't really appropriate that much art. I'm not sure if we can really talk about African art in this particular fashion, because what they were interested in were not artistic objects. What they were interested in were sacred objects that had to do with the particular faith of the people to whom these objects belonged. You could argue that Picasso was fascinated by masks, by shields, by fetishes, and all of those were ritualistic sacred objects that in many cases depicted daimons and divinities. They were not works of art as they are seen from a secular European post-French Revolution point of view. They were not fine art objects. They were not made to be pretty. In most cases, they were made for a very specific purpose. If we're talking about masks, this is very clear for which purposes they were made. They were made for ritualistic usage. And of course, this is sacred. It has to do with their traditions and the way their people live and everything. Now, what I'm getting to here is that European context of all of this was that these artists in most cases were only interested in appearance and were very superficial about it. They were interested in aesthetics of these pieces, and they found them to be daring and bold and raw and all these things that they saw as elements that were lacking in European art. They saw neoclassicism still the dominant stylistical formation in the beginning of the 20th century, in the entire first half of the 20th century, they saw it as being deprived of these qualities, and they saw African art as being full to the brim with these qualities. Now, when we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, it was a different thing. They saw African art as their cradle. They saw this as their context, their natural environment, their natural habitat, out of which they were mostly stolen and forcefully brought to a completely different country. So to them, it had a much deeper meaning, and I would argue that for them, this was not just the question of aesthetics, like it was for Picasso and people similar to him. It was not just, oh, look, this looks cool. No, it was like, this really is a part of who we are, fundamentally speaking. And this belongs to our past that was stolen from us, or rather, we were stolen from it, to be more precise. And then it has a very different meaning. So coming back to it has a very different meaning. And although you could argue that the Harlem Renaissance artists were influenced by Cubists, not the other way around quite as much, though we'll get to that as well, their connection to Africa had a lot more substance to it, and it had a lot more sense, clearly speaking, because of reasons that we've already mentioned. Now, I mentioned that the influence did not only go one way, and this is another peculiarity of this particular historical analogy, because when we're talking about connection, again, between, let's say, Gothic art and Impressionism, we can say that, yes, to a certain extent, Gothic art probably did influence Impressionist artists, and some of them were probably aware of this, one way or the other, whereas we cannot really say that Impressionism influenced Gothic art. This is just not possible, chronologically speaking. Whereas here we can say that there were some influences that were arguably very important. Now, not necessarily in terms of visual arts, because in this particular manner, I would argue that influence is quite unilateral. Whereas we're not talking about just the visual arts. We're talking about the context that engendered many different artistic forms that were very important, that were actually profoundly important, and that profoundly marked the 20th century as such. I'm talking, of course, about blues and jazz music. So when we're talking about jazz music, we're talking about something that has a lot to do with Cubism. It has a very similar technique and very similar approach, a very similar worldview, if you will. So the thing with jazz is that, now this is my understanding of jazz, so I apologize in advance if I'm to offend some connoisseurs, and if my understanding of jazz is completely wrong, but this is what it is. So you have jazz musicians playing morsels of music, fragments of music, then they throw between themselves in a sort of a dialogue that they have. The people who play different instruments are in a constant dialogue, and they communicate through their instruments. And so it's up to the audience to pick these morsels up and to make sense of them. And oftentimes when I explain Cubist art, when I'm giving guided tours, and I'm explaining Cubism, I take jazz as a comparison and as a good way of understanding what's happening in the Cubist painting, because a Cubist artist is giving you elements that you are to shuffle around yourself, so you need to activate the painting yourself. The painting is not finished. You have to finish it as an audience, as the spectator. And the similar thing happens with music, that if you listen to jazz, you have to finish it yourself. You have to make sense of what's going on, which some people cannot do, or they cannot do it quite, and some people are annoyed by jazz because they just see it as noise. They don't really get the whole process. Honestly, I sometimes struggle with doing this because I'm not terribly musical, so I kind of get both ends. I get people who enjoy jazz a lot. I get people who are annoyed by it, but yeah, it is what it is. So there's this connection. There's obvious similarity between how Cubists deal with the art they create and how jazz musicians deal with the music they create. There's a lot to be said about spontaneity, about what they call jamming, that you do not necessarily create music beforehand. You create it instantaneously. And this is something that, again, has a lot to do with Cubism as it comes out of Impressionism, and it's all about spontaneity, and it's all about the act of creation and how it instantaneously happens. And again, it's also about rivaling the industrial mode of production, photography, meaning cinema in case of Cubism, and all those things that we previously addressed. So there's a lot to be said about spontaneity and the act of creation that happens in that moment. And something, of course, that is very important for jazz as it is important for Cubism. Now, you could say that you can be extremely nerdy about jazz, and many people are. And you can see technique, and you can say, oh, you need to have flawless, immaculate technique if you want to play around with it. If you want to spontaneously create, you have to be a technical master. You could argue the same thing about Cubism. You have to say that you have to have a lot of deep understanding of space and objects and how objects exist in space, how human bodies exist in space, if you want to deconstruct them in a sensible manner. So you could say that, yes, you can be incredibly nerdy about Cubism as well. And this is something that is really interesting because it's a stylistical formation that combines extreme nerdiness, if you will, with this endless fascination for primitivism, because it is very, I wouldn't say primitive, but primitivist. And I find it so interesting that people, the artists that created in the context of Harlem Renaissance, we'll mention some of them later, were probably, I mean, very likely aware of this. They were aware of the connection. Of course, they were very much aware of people like Picasso and Matisse, etc., and they created, oftentimes inspired by them. Now, this is a very touchy topic to address, and something that I guess I have to show some sort of caution dealing with it, is that the problem is that people that created in the context of the Harlem Renaissance sought to do it with a very specific political and societal goal. They sought betterment and advancement and emancipation. They wanted their race, their community, their people to be recognized as fully human. And they've adopted a style that was extremely primitivist and atavistic. They basically adopted a style that dealt with all of the stereotypes that they sought to escape. Because the way European people, Cubist artists, used African art was that they saw primitivism in it. They saw it as incredibly primitive. This is what attracted them to it. Now, from today's perspective, I would subjectively, personally argue that they saw African art completely wrong. That's not at all what African art was, but that's how they saw it. And I find it so curious that these people would seek primitivism, they would seek animality, they would seek rawness, all of these things that people in the States were trying to escape from. They were trying to escape from these harmful stereotypes, and they were trying to promote themselves, well, as simply human. This was the whole thing. And certain actors of the Harlem Renaissance movement were quite explicit about this. They said that they're only interested in propaganda because they suffered from propaganda so much that they were victims of propaganda for so much that now they want to create art that is nothing but propaganda, but the one that is organized in their favor and that represents them favorably. So this was said by William Dubois. Now, there's a bit of an issue here. Most people pronounce his name as Du Bois. It's Dubois. I mean, people who are English speakers and people who are from that particular community still say Du Bois, but it's a French name. You're reading it Dubois. Whatever, you know what I'm talking about. You know who I'm talking about. I'll probably continue saying Dubois because it just makes sense to me. But yeah, this is the person we're talking about. So yeah, this is a scholar and a theoretician and an incredibly important voice in the Harlem Renaissance, and someone who sought to emancipate and better the African American community, and someone who was very much progenitor of the entire movement. So he said that he is only interested in art that is propaganda, which of course makes sense, and especially makes a lot of sense if you situate this in the chronological context of the 20th century, where so much art is overtly or less overtly so political. And we were talking about many different stylistical formations that are openly political. And you can argue that if we're talking about hip-hop, it's an incredibly politically engaged culture. And if we're talking about rap music, it's an incredibly politically loaded and charged kind of music, genre of music. If you think about bands like A Tribe Called Quest or Public Enemy or Grandmaster Flash, I mean, these people are incredibly political. And of course, they should be. KRS-One, I mean, I could give more references, but you get the point. So these are the people who really address their communities, the issues their communities have, the way they struggle. So, of course, they have many different optics. If you think about Notorious B.I.G., if you think about Tupac, if you think about N.W.A., all these individuals or bands are strongly political, even if they appear as if they're not aware of it. You could say this about Tupac because his mother was an important political activist, a member of the Black Panthers, and that's a whole other story we're not going to get into now. The point is that politics are incredibly important and much more important for Harlem Renaissance than they were for Cubists. Because I guess they didn't need to have it that important for them. Cubists could stay fairly superficial and fairly plastic and visual with their interests and with their engagements, whereas these people that acted with the Harlem Renaissance really were acting for their lives. They sought to better their lives. They sought to better their communities. This was not just art that is meant to be pretty and to sit pretty on your wall. No, this was a very important field of political battle. Now, I wouldn't even say ideological. I would really say political, because this is not in the realm of theory. This is something that had to do with everyday life. And it's something that really had a lot to do with how African-American community lived in the United States of America, be it South or North. The fact that thanks to the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of the people in this community had the opportunity to see plays that were written by the members of the community. They saw films with actors that were not Caucasian people in blackface, but were actual African-American people, which of course is important. And they saw for the first time plays or films that do not represent them through the optics of stereotypes, but more as they are. There were certain instructions to be made, saying if you want to write a play, you can actually represent an African-American person that is something other than a vagrant or a prostitute or a thief. So they were encouraged to represent more of normal people, everyday people, people that had, well, I say normal, that's kind of a loaded term, but people that did not necessarily fit with one of those categories that we just mentioned. So this was a really, really important thing that ran to the very core of a community, and it was not quite as, I wouldn't say elitist, I wouldn't call the Cubism elitist, but it was far more in the realm of real life than it was in the realm of arts. I will just stay with saying that. And I want to address this because, again, on one end, we have an entire movement that fights very clearly and very actively in a most engaged manner, fights stereotypes and wants to bring down stereotypes and wants to prove that these stereotypes, for most, are wrong. And then in the other context, we have European context, these stereotypes being used with abandon and being used in the most direct, obvious manner. Again, I would argue fairly superficially. And these two styles share very similar aesthetics. Now, this is what is so interesting about it, because if you look at the art that was created between these two styles, you can see that it's very, very similar, and that it looks very, very, well, visually, it's strikingly similar. Now, on one end, people are trying to build up black pride, and they're trying to build up this notion of not being ashamed of having been subjected to slavery for so long, activating their humanity, actualizing their humanity. So these are all very important things, and they're using one certain aesthetic to do it. On the other end, you have people who are seeking, well, to bring some freshness to staleness of their art, and they're using that same aesthetic. Now, again, the interesting thing about this is that these people who were fighting for their, well, lives in a way, for their fighting for their representation, took the aesthetics that was based on stereotypes, and that was based on very superficial stereotypes. Now, why did this happen, and how did it happen? You could argue that at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance movement, the first paintings that were being produced were done in a fairly, I would say, pre-modern fashion, pre-avant-garde, very realistic fashion, I would say, in a style of realism, or some styles that are similar around it. Not quite neoclassical academism, but more in realistic sense. So this was seen as retrograde, and this was seen as reactionary. So the entire idea was that a style was to be found that was more modern, that was more in line with modern and contemporary tendencies. So this is the reason why Cubism was chosen. I'm not sure if it was done spontaneously or intentionally, but the idea was that we need a style that is basically in line with modern tendencies and that is not stuck in the past, because the whole idea was to bring this community up to speed with contemporary life. And this is something that I find really interesting because, again, it has to do not only with visual arts, but it has to also to do with cinema, with theater, with music, the music being perhaps the most important part of it, that in certain arts that were created during the industrial period, we can't necessarily have the same chronology as we had in arts that were around before it. Now, what am I talking about exactly? Well, if you study, let's say, literature, or you study music or history of art, visual arts, you will most likely deal with similar periods, more or less. So you will deal with medieval period, then the Renaissance, then Baroque, then classicism, neoclassicism, romanticism. So in all of these different studies that you can do, you will deal with these periods. Now, this is not possible when it comes to cinema, of course, because there was no cinema in the medieval period. There was no technology for it. So when we're talking about the development of cinema, we are talking about a very different chronology, and some of it overlaps with chronology of other older arts, but some of it is quite new. And you could argue then that, let's say, we have German expressionism in cinema, very important part of history of cinema, but we don't necessarily have anything that's comparable to Renaissance. I mean, we can have Renaissance qualities in a piece of cinema. We can have Baroque qualities. We have Baroque Western, for example. That's quite interesting. But we don't have something that would fully be comparable to Italian Baroque or Dutch Baroque or any other Baroque. So we have this whole idea that these new arts, new media, have to catch up. They have to have this condensed development. And this is to a certain extent true when it comes to the Harlem Renaissance, that is not an art, but is a formation or a school of thought, if you will, because they sought to bring themselves up to speed. They sought to basically catch up with whatever was happening in the rest of the world and to present themselves as a part of that world. And so they had to accelerate. They had to go really, really fast. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's because its connection with Africa on one end and Cubism on the other is such that Cubism seeks to situate itself outside of all of this. It seeks to go back to what is truly fundamentally human. And when I say this, I mean that they are inspired by ancient art. One of the reasons why they're so enthralled and enamored by African art is that they see it as standing outside of time. They see African art as something that doesn't follow this European chronology of development. They see it as basically frozen in time. It's as if these people and their artifacts were not touched by time, and they didn't have the same linearity of time that European people had. So to them, there was this idea that, again, ironically enough, has to do with neoclassicism and with classical and even pagan periods of European history. This idea that art is somehow situated outside of time. This very, very European idea that if we're talking about true art, true beauty, eternal truths as such, they exist outside of time. This is why most European artists were strongly anchored in the realm of myth, because they saw myth as something that is outside of time. It happened in some nondescript past that always exists, and it doesn't exist at the same time. So this is why they were inspired by African art, because they saw it as pretty much being the same. That they saw some African people as being primitive, again, many air quotes here, untouched by civilization, by progress, by industry, but also by a linearity of time. Not to say untouched by time itself. That would be incredibly dramatic and somehow very wrong. But the idea is this, that they sought something that is fundamentally human, and they saw it outside of time at the same time, this is very poorly worded, while being situated in the past. Now, when we were talking about Harlem Renaissance, they wanted their connection with Africa to have to do with their roots and their cradle and their humanity that was, again, stolen from them and deprived from them for centuries. It wasn't really quite as connected to the whole industrial, problematic. But on the other end, they did live in the most industrialized country in the world. They did migrate from the rural south to the industrial north. So this too was a part of their everyday life. And then we can say that whichever relation that we already discussed, the Cubists had with the industrial world, people in the Harlem Renaissance had it as well. And this is something that is just not to be neglected. This is something that we just have to address. Now, I want to mention a couple of artists. We have to mention a couple of names here that are quite important. Jacob Lawrence, I would say, is one of these names that dealt with art in a very, very similar manner in which Cubists were doing it. So we are talking about simplified representations here. We're talking about very few colors. Style that is fairly close, I would say, to Fauvism almost as much as it is to Cubism. So we are talking about this whole idea that simplicity is key, and that the less you use, the more it means and the more powerful it is. Well, we have this whole idea of simplifying, of seeking what is raw, what is direct, what is authentic, and seeking the originally, again, African-American experience. A lot of this is incredibly political. A lot of this speaks of the flight of the black people, of their plights, of their troubles, of their issues, and of the entire political context of being African-American in the 20th century, especially in the first half of the 20th century. But using this very, very I would argue, European aesthetic. Now, why do I say European? Because this is very close to Fauvism, it's very close to Cubism. Most of all, it's close to Cubism, but it has hints of surrealism and of metaphysical painting as well. It has hints of De Chirico. It has hints of Van Gogh here and there, sometimes direct references to the works of Van Gogh. So it's funny how these people seek betterment using European arts and European stylistical formations, whereas most of their issues, most of the reasons why they suffered for so long were, European to begin with. But yeah, so try to stay out of that conversation for a while. Now, and at the other end, we have Aaron Douglas as an artist, and someone who is really interesting visually. Now, clearly, we can see, Cubist influences in his art, and clearly we can see, again, simplicity, very curious color palette. Now, this is something that I find quite engaging. Again, this is not just looking at Cubism, it's looking at a lot of different European stylistical formations. I would say there's a hint of futurism there. We can see the influence of Delaunay's, Sonia and Robert Delaunay, with the fascination with light. But overall, thematically speaking, we can see that this is the kind of art that deals with dawn of humanity and that deals with nature. There's a very strong presence of natural themes, themes of the jungle, themes of the people in their original, and again, I hesitate to say primitive context. So this is very close to this connection that we have between primitivism and Cubism. But again, if we are to make a very clear distinction between how it was used in Europe and how it was used in the United States of America, because usages are very, very important and the contexts are completely different. And this is something that we need to address. Now, there is another thing to be mentioned here, and it has to do with, I would say, dancing of Josephine Baker. I invite you to look for videos of Josephine Baker dancing and to see just how incredibly racist it is. I mean, she was a woman of color, obviously, but her dancing was actualizing and enacting all of the most vicious stereotypes that were used against African American communities. So I'm not even going to go and describe it. I'm just inviting you to go and see these dances yourself. So I'm kind of perplexed by this, honestly. I'm not entirely sure what her creative process was. I'm not sure if she was using these stereotypes mockingly, or she just non-ironically embraced them on first degree, as the French people say, or there was something else to it. But to a certain extent, we can say that Cubist aesthetics were incredibly racist too, because they saw African art as primitive, because they saw it completely decontextualized. They didn't bother to look into its context, and they used it as they wanted to, for their own purposes and for their own context that had nothing to do with Africa as such. Of course, this is all extremely colonial, and it takes us to this very simple fact that most of these objects were, well, stolen from Africa. They were brought to Europe as a part of the colonial conquest, as a part of the colonial exploits. So even this is something that doesn't really speak favorably of Cubists and people who were interested in these objects, and people who were interested in these objects in this particular manner. So I want to address this, how should I say, problem that you have artists dealing with stereotypes by embracing these stereotypes, enacting them. And I'm kind of hoping that this is what they were doing, but then again, I'm not sure because I wasn't there to ask them. So if we're talking about, let's say, Aaron Douglas aesthetics, and when we're talking about presenting an African American as a man in the jungle, as a man rising from the grass, as a man that is strongly connected to nature in this particular manner, I really wonder what it was all about. Because if we look at this from the Cubist point of view, Cubism as it was in Europe, in France of the early 20th century, we still have this whole colonial and how should I say, post-Christian, I would say, attitude, that there is a very strong division between the realm of the mind and the realm of the body. Now, I don't say the soul. Usually we're talking about soul and body. No, this is really about the mind. This is this colonial idea that European people are incredibly cerebral, that they're very intelligent, that they're sophisticated, they're educated. Again, nothing could be further from the truth, but whatever. So this is what European people are like. On the other end, we have people from the rest of the world. You could argue it's the first world and then the third world, who are everything the opposite to that. So they're corporal. They're not educated. They're not smart. They're not cerebral. They're not mental even. They're very animalistic. They exist in their bodies. And as such, they are connected to nature. They belong to nature more so than they belong to the society. This takes us back to these two dichotomies, incredibly important dichotomies, that are society and nature, or civilization, if you will, and not instead of society on one end, and then nature on the other. And so it's a very common and very racist and very colonial trope that European people of the colonial era, which is roughly speaking last 500 years, sought to look at the world in these particular ways. So they sought to see themselves, the colonizer, as intelligent and cerebral and educated, and people who had manners, and people who were civilized, just to be simple about it. And then they saw the rest of the world as being uncivilized. So mind was theirs and body was of everyone else. And when we look at Aaron Douglas's paintings and his visual work, we see a lot of, well, humanity, a lot of African American, or in this case we can argue African humanity, as being connected to nature rather than with society. We see these people, again, emerging from the ground, from the jungle. And so we're like, wait a minute, what is happening here? It's kind of strange to see it in this context. Now, I'm trying to understand these particular paintings as, again, rooting the African American community with Africa, with their initial context, out of which they were stolen and forcefully brought to a completely different land and country and culture. But it is really important to mention that all of these representations had to do with the aesthetics as they were created in colonial Europe. Because we have to understand that chronological and historical context of Cubism is such that it takes place in a strongly colonial Europe. This is still Europe before World War II, after which we start going through a decolonializing process. This is Europe where France has a massive colonial empire, where Great Britain has a massive colonial empire, and this is the moment where no one is really arguing colonies as a concept. We don't get to this point in history yet where we say, wait, this is perhaps wrong to exploit all of these people and to take their resources and to take their labor and to take pretty much everything they have and to brutally genocide them and to massacre them and to cut off their limbs and any other colonial nightmare that you can think of. So we are not yet in this period where we question all these things and when we say, well, colonialism was actually horrible. No, if we're talking about the first half of the 20th century, we are still talking about the period where colonialism is seen as the most natural thing ever. Of course, by people who are colonizers, not necessarily by the people who are colonized. So what I'm so intrigued by here is that we have the cultural context of colonizers, meaning Cubism on one end, and cultural context of people who suffered immensely from the process of colonialization, which is the African-American community. They are using the same aesthetics for their, creative outlets, I would say. But again, when it comes to Harlem Renaissance artists, this is not just a creative outlet, it's so much more than that. It's a vital question of not necessarily their survival, but their emancipation. Whereas in Europe, it's a completely different thing. And it's a curious thing that this exists as such. Now, it's also a curious thing that if we're talking about Africa and the general African context, we're talking about many different Africas that exist and coexist, rather. Because we can understand that we said already that Africa is an immense continent, incredibly diverse within itself. So we cannot properly talk about Africa as such. But we also have Africa not as it is, an incredibly complicated and complex continent, but also Africa as how we see it. So we have Africa as it is, whatever that may be, and then Africa as how it is seen, the image of Africa rather, that exists both with European people and with American people. Now, we already addressed how the European people, how Cubists saw Africa from their own lens. They saw it as a place where primitivism comes from and things that are curious but raw and natural and whatnot, all of that. Whereas the Americans saw a completely different Africa, African Americans, and the Africa that African Americans saw was very different to Africa that rest of America saw. So we are really in the 20th century here because we're talking about one source of inspiration for different artists and stylistical formations that exists and coexists in very different manners. Now, I want to go back to all of this. We've mentioned hip-hop, and we've given a couple of hip-hop references when we were talking about music, but there's also more to it than the music itself. We have the person of Ali Shama, an artist who labels himself as a hip-hop cubist. And this is really interesting because we are talking about the connection of all of these things. We were to mention this branching of Harlem Renaissance and their lasting influence, and how aesthetics of Cubism play into all of that. How Cubism, in a very curious manner, is connected to the African American community well after the Harlem Renaissance that, as we said, ended with the Great Depression and during the Great Depression. This is something that endures. This visual aesthetic, but I would also argue ideological legacy carries on, and it truly permeates both hip-hop culture and explicit, visual statements and aesthetics created by artists that act in it. So I took Ali Shama as, probably the most well-known, the most recognizable reference in this regard. And it's interesting if we're looking at his works of art to see that he really goes back to the early 20th century. He brings together the whole street art graffiti genre with the context of the early 20th century in both Europe. I would even argue more Europe than America, but certainly with the Harlem Renaissance. We see that his paintings are not just cubist, but again have hints of futurism there. We have hints of surrealism, of metaphysical painting. But yeah, they stay most strongly anchored in the Cubist aesthetics. Now, I wanted to address this because talking about Ali Shama has a lot to do with, of course, politics, had a lot to do with all of these issues. Yeah, I also want to mention another important artist in this particular realm. This is Grace Jones, an actress, a model, a singer, many other things, an activist, you could say. And I specifically want to address her collaboration with Jean-Paul Goude, the French designer and photographer, who's made a series of illustrations and posters and photo montages, really with Grace Jones, where he is connecting her strongly with the African context, with this particular atavism that we were talking about, this particular animality. He connects her to the animal world, to the natural world. He is immensely inspired by Grace Jones and sees her as this force of nature, really. And then, of course, later he was criticized for racism and all these things. Both him and her argued that there was nothing racist about it, quite the contrary, not to get into all of that. The point is that we have this same inspiration appear at the end of the 20th century as it existed in the beginning of the 20th century. And it really goes together with our entire initiative of historical analogies. Grace Jones, I would argue, is most importantly present in the 80s. This is when we see most of the ads that were designed by Jean-Paul Goude, most of the posters. We see her musical career take off in the 80s. And this is also when hip-hop becomes really prominent. It becomes a really big deal, although it starts earlier. It's really the 80s and the 90s when it explodes. I hope this made sense. This was a bit of a different historical analogies. Again, we are nearing the end of this series, and so we are slowly beginning to wrap it up. One other thing that is happening here is that you've probably noticed, getting closer and closer to our contemporary period, and very often we are talking about people, or about artists who are still alive, who are still active. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you again. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a nice day. Ciao.